Good afternoon. Welcome to the heart of Turtle Island. Welcome to the Forks. This is where we're recording live. It'll be on YouTube. And we're at the Jason where the Assiniboine and the Red River meets. And it's a very important historical site where the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba's center is located. And it's appropriate to be here in this location because Indigenous people have been here for over 9,600 years, this location alone. But it was a hub of connecting with many nations that would gather here, and they call this the gathering place for trade. And this is one of the sacred places where all agree not to have conflict here. It was a safe zone, a sacred place. It was after all the heart of the turtle, Turtle Island. So there's a lot of history on these grounds. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about myself and my connection with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. I am honored to have the Treaty Commissioner with us today and in this beautiful place of learning, especially when it was launched in 2007, that we were all treaty people, and it was for Manitobans. Now there was a little controversy back then with that statement that we're all treaty people. That's why we needed to do this. This is why this is established to help Manitobans to know their own history, which wasn't taught in schools. It was held in darkness. And I joined shortly after when it was beginning in 2008. So if I did the math correctly, I think that's 16 years as being part of the Speakers Bureau. So I'm going to introduce myself in my spirit name. Waabishki Mazinazoot Michtaatim Bizhiw Doodem, Skownan Treaty 2 territory, Anishinaabek. My spirit name is White Spotted Horse of the Lynx Clan. I'm from Skownan First Nation of Treaty 2. I currently live in Treaty 1 by Coates Creek. And my common name is Sutherland. Now, as my good friend had mentioned in a little short bio, it's on our website, I'm currently with two CFS agencies, West Region and Anishinaabe of Treaty 2. But prior to that, I was with Treaty 2 and helping create a lifelong learning environment, but to do research and to come up with a different template, a way of governing ourselves, other than under the Indian Act, other than being under Canada. So I was involved with Treaty 2 for a couple of years. A lot of fine and good work that took place, especially defining what is the 17 areas that need to be addressed when it comes to our treaty relations, promises that were made in 1871 till now. But what was very important for us is that these institutions that we're currently in wasn't given, it was enforced upon under Canadian law to take away our Indigenous governings, our clan system. So that's the struggle that we have in our community, was that that's all we knew. That's all we knew about how to govern ourselves under the Indian Act, the Chief and Council system. Now, a little background with me is I wanted to share with you that I grew up in my community called Skownan First Nation. I was raised by my grandparents, Gilbert and Hilda Neepanak. And when I look back on on my life growing up on reserve, initially I lived in Winnipeg. In 1970, the law was going to be revised that the the removal of children from their homes and their communities to be taken to an Indian residential school is to now become to an end. So my grandparents, says we'll want to raise him. At that time, it was very traumatic. Why do I leave my siblings? And at the time, I was very much didn't want it. Within time, though, I got to understand the situation my grandparents were. They didn't have a chance to raise their children. And now they have a chance to raise me. And it was the best place to grow up. A community that less than 500 people in a semi-isolated community surrounded by natural law, nature, and my people were survivors in a traditional sense. They make their living off the land. So my grandfather had a ranch. My grandmother had her garden. Grandfather lived a lifestyle of being a hunter, a fisherman, a commercial fisherman, trapper, and very self-sufficient. So in those humble days, there was no electricity. It was just a cabin with no electricity. And eventually, they moved them closer to the road so they could. It's easier for me to jump on a bus that was 10 miles away. I reflect on my life because at this age in my life, I look back at my journey, and I have tremendous gratitude to be raised by grandparents that are well connected to not only our community but to all our communities surrounding Skownan. So here's a little child being taken to all these homes because that's what you do, you visit. And I'm just look like, when I look back at myself, it's just like I look like I'm bored. But I'm actually listening to the stories, to everything. As I doodle and draw pictures, I'm absorbing it. I have learned since then how the human body, the human mind works, that your subconsciousness will store all information. And that'll play a tremendous part when later on I was asked to join the Speakers Bureau because I created a historical timeline that's based on oral traditions from all those stories. And I had the stories to back it up. I had the stories from our elders, I had the stories from our leadership. I've always been an observer. I never planned on speaking in front of people, but it ended up being that way. So I just wanted to share the title today. It's called Healing Colonization. Because it's my observation as a child living in a small community. I guess I'm halfway through it. I left in 1999 and I came to Winnipeg, and I've been here ever since. So I'm a person of both worlds, very traditional and very much contemporary. I stand in both worlds. And that's what shapes me, is that how to convey, even reconcile my relationship with this world. Because it started off, when you go into the city, you're not wanted. I had this conversation with some ladies yesterday that I grew up being called an Indian. I was addressed as such. And I went to Dauphin and Brandon and Winnipeg. Well, growing up, the word itself didn't have no malice to it, no meanness to it, because we're all Metis, Soto, Scottish, Ukrainian, and different backgrounds. So we do joke against each other, but it was never mean-spirited. It only felt mean when you get to a city like Winnipeg. And I couldn't understand that. But that was part of my learning. Why is that? Because as an observer of life all around me, I became an observer of history. I was living in history. So I could convey that history from a personal point of view. So that's my background. I've been teaching Indigenous cultural awareness since 1999. And I've been a Speakers Bureau, part of the treaty relations since 2008. And I've been going on a healing journey with my traditions, recovery of my identity as being Anishinaabe. And I can really say, like I went to ceremonies, but I didn't really went all in to reclaim my identity until 2007. I became a sun dancer. Now I have my own place called Ginew Healing Lodge, where people could come for land-based connections, spiritual connections, healing, teachings. We do all kinds of ceremony. So these two agencies want that. They're in the middle of decolonizing their own law, the Child Welfare Act, to create their own philosophies, their own way of how they're going to look after the children. So that it became now not a bureaucratic system that you inherit. It is now becoming the child is the center law. So we do everything we can for that child. But there are still tasks to be done there. It's very, very much, there's a lot of traumatic issues that we need to address. And that's reconciling that. So reconciliation is a framework for Canadians, but it's actually how do we reconcile our experience directly affected by the Canadians. Because along the way, I did my part to share what is treaties. You know, what are the factual events that took place. A lot of it was from our elders, from our leaders, talking about the oral traditions and what led up to that treaty, Treaty 1 and 2. So along the way, and creating a timeline to showcase a history that was very much segregated from the rest of Canada, was an Indigenous timeline of events that took place. And when I started teaching this, and I was placed in front of all the other speakers. Oh gosh, talk about being nervous. Because in the room, you had professors, you had teachers, you had all the speakers that were involved that the treaty commissioner, Dennis Whitebird, wanted to bring together. And he says, teach them what you have. He used to put it on the table for about a couple of weeks. And they said it just arms bureaucrats and politicians, because they have to sit there. We deliberately make them sit there for at least 15 minutes. And they have to see the record. Now I have to present this to the rest of the group. Oh my gosh, I did my 30 minutes. Then they had questions. It started on one end over there. And it had to be a lot of it was non-Indigenous that started on that end. There was researchers, professors, and teachers, and it was going around the room. Then it became our people, our Indigenous teachers, and then by the time you get over here, it was elders and even our own politicians. So it went around circle. And they went on with a lot of little details. Like you're trying to pick me apart. And I did the best I can to answer why I have it on there. Why did I say those things? So by the time I got around to our own people, they were very animate by voicing that finally we're talking about who we are. That story has not been told in our institutions. That's why we're here. And it was reinforced by the elders as, no, even I did not know this. And we need to teach this to our people. So it might have started by saying why we're all treaty people, but it became a truth. It became the truth that needs to be shared with everyone in Manitoba. So we started off with partnerships with Parks Canada, with many with government, because we need to educate the system itself, and eventually this leads into now going into the schools, which had the greatest impact, because since that time, children from the youngest age to all the way to post-secondary, university and such, now it's mandatory in one university. This is mandatory that you got to learn history of Indigenous history. It's an investment of saying who we are. Because when I started talking to groups in the classroom, in the schools, and auditoriums, I always start out with a very simple question back then. How did Canada become a country? And they didn't really know. Because it was no wonder, because it wasn't taught in schools. It would have been the most beautiful story to teach that in the beginning. Because Canada became a country because of its relationships with the original nations and their generosity to share land with them. That's a beautiful story. It wasn't about buying or taking over or battles or conquest. That didn't happen. What gets mixed up is we get bombarded with the United States, which at that stage when they started doing Treaty 1 to 11, it was, especially at the time of Treaty 1 in the 1860s, there was the Indian Wars with the United States. So people got to know that we were allies, nothing to fear. We'll defend the medicine line, which eventually becomes the border between the United States and Canada. If it wasn't for Indigenous allies, we very much could have been United States of America. And I can count 4 separate times in that history where United States of America tried to annex Canada. And it's still going on. Because this new president, he's coming back, Trump, is insulting our prime minister by calling him a governor of the 51st state. So, in all their hearts and their dark places, they still think that way. But it'll never happen because Indigenous people will always defend the land. And our land is shared, and it's called Kanata, our village. And we're not European, we're not French, we're not English, we're not United States for that matter. We are an Indigenous-based country, which is it's our settlement, it's our village. That's what Canada means. So these are all beautiful stories that elders and our leaders are able to share through the Speakers Bureau to talk about. Now you can get to hear our perspective, to know the truth of treaties. First of all, you didn't know about treaties, but now we're going to teach you what treaties are about. I'm glad that Parks Canada is here, because when I first joined them, I went there for 9 years to help that message that the national home of treaties is Lower Fort Garry. And as I walk up the walkway, there's a little plaque that had the word, who are the signatories of this treaty, Treaty 1. But there was that one word, ceded, that stands out for me. And that was the message that Canada always had, was that you surrendered, you're ceded, you yield all responsibilities in the creation of Canada. And so I said, oh gosh, that's probably one of the first things I want to change. Then I found out that there was attempts that have been trying to change that plaque since the 1950s. And that was the 3rd attempt. So anyway, we still haven't resolved it. All we just did was remove the plaque and put it in the warehouse. But the thing is, the pressure or the knowledge that was invested in Manitoba and Winnipeg, and now spreading to the rest of Canada, was that That's no longer is a message on how Canada became a country. It wasn't through the means of warfare, battle, buying, or ceded. So even Canadians are coming to the truth of it. It was about sharing. It was about sharing, and the original peoples shared. And that's what's needed. That's what still needs to be talked about in this country, because even though we have reconciliation as a national mandate, it's not going anywhere. Even our recently late Murray Sinclair, who was involved since the 70s to bring change. He became Manitoba's first, judge, and later on the Manitoba Justice Inquiry, and then later on he became the Truth and Reconciliations Commissioner and a senator, always in the movement of positive change. So when he was quoted by saying, "I'll never see reconciliation in this country," I have to admit I was a little upset, because aren't we all working towards a better Canada? And that so much has been done. But as I reflect on his words, I reflect that how can you really say reconciliation can be fulfilled if Canada has one of the race legislation or race law, and the whole world doesn't have it, but Canada has one called the Indian Act. And if it's still around and it still exists, then you can never truly have reconciliation. And it's basically, that's where you learn all these things from the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. We break it down. We break down what is the Royal Proclamation about, recognizing that we're all sovereign nations by the Crown. Recognizing that the treaties that are here to bring harmony to the Red River settlement in 1817 is a treaty that needs to be learned around here. But events that lead up in the 1860s to the 1871 is very important to understand that these are the building blocks or foundation that build a country from coast to coast to coast. But 5 years later, after 1871, the Indian Act. But this was already in the works. So even though their spirit and intentions wasn't there, they're going to fulfill their plan that on the British North American Act, Section 9124, that they are in control over Indians and their lands without any Indigenous representation present at all. And I was talking to a young lady that was there that motivated a crowd that were gathering at the legislation grounds a couple of years ago, to remember the children. And what inspired next was that eventually the statue of Queen Victoria was toppled over. It was dragged over by ropes. And I says, "Tell me about it. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. Tell me about it." She says, "I don't know what came over me. But, I just shouted out, let's pull that down." And it's Queen Victoria. And they took off her crown. Now, that's going to be controversy because we've got a lot of crown support. But I do understand in our treaty medal, we have Queen Victoria here. And she did it right when the Canadians approached her and says, "We want those lands." And she had to remind her that her grandfather had set up a proclamation on how you make treaties by recognizing that they are sovereign nations. We don't own their lands. It might say British North America on the map, but that's as far as it goes. Those are our friends. Those are our allies. And gave the detail on how you make treaty with them. And I thought that was great. She's setting it up. You got to make treaty with them. Those are not your lands. You got to make treaty. But I can understand why there might be, as a historian, there might be some, I'm not happy with things that are not, I'm not happy with Queen Victoria. For instance, you don't put the fox in a hen house. Inspect the good outcome. So they put the first commissioners, and those commissioners were there for a decade, only to look after the interests of the new Canadians and their new government, the Dominion of Canada. So they weren't really, when you look at the research and you look at the letters, because we did a lot of research in Treaty 2, that there was supposed to be a plan, a business plan, and how you share the wealth, half of the wealth of the country. Archibald had that, but he didn't know how to make a treaty. But he also represents John A. Macdonald, who happens to be his childhood friend, even though it's separate parties. But they said, we got to get the signature. And that's what it's about. We got to get an agreement. And the controversy of Treaty 1 was, the treaty was signed. That's all it said. Didn't talk about, this is oral traditions. This is, even from your community, that talks about, there's nothing here for us, we'll take our chances. You want to treat us over there at home. So there was a lot of that fear, because there was the Indian Wars. Oh my God, this whole thing is going to fall apart. So they met in secret all night long. And when you look at the historical description of it, they said the treaty was signed. And yet our community member says we didn't sign it. Even Chief Yellowquill says we didn't sign it. I never take their gifts. That oral tradition is still alive in the hearts and our oral traditions and our own research now. Treaty 2 has 17 outstanding issues. It's ready to go to court. But they'll pick us a little at a time. Recently, it's cows and plows. Little things at a time. So we have to keep going at it. And the best way to go at this is to reconcile that history, is to understand the truth of it. And now what can we do to reconcile that? Are we still going to keep fighting in the courts? Because that's, in the end, there's not going to be real winners here. There's going to be a lot of animosity. But I'll use metaphors by telling people, you know, you got yourself this beautiful card, this credit card, but there's a limit. And we reached that limit a long time ago. And now you've been receiving the bill, the invoice, the bill, pay up. And you're delaying, but it's still going to accumulate percentage. It doesn't resolve anything. It still has to be addressed. You can't hide from that responsibility. Once again, the Anishinaabe is compassionate. We're known as people of the heart because we share this country. We are interacting with each other for over almost 300 years. And once again, we just says, let's work out a payment plan. Doesn't have to be devastating, but first recognize us that we are gonna govern our own selves, but within the systems. We already have a template. But addressed, these are the things you owe us. It might hurt in the beginning, but in the long run, we're back to reconciling that past. So 2 things. Get rid of the Indian Act. 150th year and 2 years from now, it's not going to be about celebrating it, but they're not even want to commemorate it because they want to hide it, keep it in the dark. This is the one legislation that says, I'm a ward of Canada. Section 35 of the Constitution was a means to say, let's define that relationship. And it hasn't been done, but we know who we are, we know how it's going to work. So the second part is recognize our sovereignty within Canada. But those are big picture stuff. We got leadership, we got a treaty commissioner here that helps guide this too. But just when when we talked about this in 1996 of a clearinghouse and a treaty house with Treaty 4, we talked about how we combine our might to take on government. The Treaty Relations Commission in Manitoba, you still had a fighter in Dennis Whitebird, but there was a mandate that says we need to educate everyone. We took that approach by not trying to be political about it, but saying the best way for all of us is to learn from each other. And there has been a lot of great learning ever since. And it will still continue on because that national mandate is not over. There's still a lot of work to be done. So getting to the title, Healing Colonization, is that when I started talking about the big picture, then I realized who were we as Anishinaabe before contact. You see, in my community, we had trading posts in Selkirk, not Selkirk, Salt, no, what do you call it, Salt. Anyway, there's a small community just across from Winnipeg, Moses, and there was a trading post there. But we were still, it's all our territory, nobody was nearby. We didn't have places like Waterhen and Meadow Portage. We just basically were on our own. So for 100 years, all these events, it's in the memory of my grandparents that told me how things were. And now it's in me. And we were survivors. We did well. The only time after World War I, then they started moving into our area and our territory. They started setting up their municipal locations. So that's within 100 years. So I have that knowledge on how we weren't suffering. We never was suffering. We had a good life, living with nature, in harmony with nature. But the events that are taking place started with the Indian agent. Then the churches built their churches, an Indian agent. And then later on, the evolution of government programming, and the first one was welfare. And then later on, became health transfer, and but we're inheriting a colonial system. That's all we know. And yet, when I go into ceremonies, I heard of an alternative called the clan system, and it was about responsibilities. So we were going to do a modern clan system for Treaty 2. The model's there. But even in our Treaty 2 territory, it wasn't acceptable. Because all they know is the Indian Act. All they know is what they've been given. So if you live in a life of scarcity, and that's all you know, and you're afraid that somebody's going to take it away from you, whatever you have, whatever you're expecting, then you're not going to be open to the fact that we do have a more healing, governing way. Anyway, we're not ready. Treaty 8 says we're ready. You're doing a lot of good work based on what we're doing. Treaty 1 says we're going to do the economic approach with Capcom Barracks, but we seen your model, we like your model, but we got to do the economic one first. Treaty 5 are still in consultation with each other, but they've seen our model. Treaty 4 has been working at it for a long time, so they kind of still working on it. But we all got together by saying we gotta have another model that's based on treaties as a collective right, because that's where the strength is. Not because of an election of a chief and council. It's the people themselves. So we had all these discussions for a long time. So it's still there. But what I've been doing is educating all of us, our own people, to understand what happened to us, colonization experience, what about the Indian Act still with us, what does it do? Even yesterday, I'm still talking about what is the treaty rights. Well, first of all, that $5 you get every year is not a payment. It's a gift from Queen Victoria. So that's a symbol. That was the only symbols that we had for the longest time that made us special, made us unique. That there's always going to be a commissioner representing government to be coming with $5 bills, and they want us to sign for our name, and then there's the RCMP, these red serge, and there was a ceremony called Treaty Days. Little kid doesn't know what that's all about. All he's going to do is get $5 and go to Adam's store. But that was amazing that they were obligated to do this. They almost covered up everything else. So, once again, you get this from our speakers, a direct experience from their memories, from oral traditions. We also have the modern leaders that has that too. But how do you apply to all this to now? Like, how do you modernize it? You have to. You have to, because we live in a different world. But you obtain what is best for you, the value systems, the responsibilities, and how that is defined. In other words, what makes you unique? But you still have choices, free will. So you can choose what you have known about for over 60 years, or you can hybrid, mingle it together, or you can do something very traditional. That decision is for each community. But there has to be something better. What we currently have doesn't work. And that's why I focus on the healing colonization aspect of it, because when Canada started this process called Truth and Reconciliation, they left out healing. They copied this framework from South Africa. Again, colonization. They even borrowed the same policies from Canada. And I was talking to a lady about that the other day, and we're just comparing notes. How they take a small group of people that create laws over overwhelming population of black people, and how they have to abide by the law. But to this day, they still struggle, because they know they just can't go back to the old system and hope things get better. They made their attempt with the process of focusing on truth, reconciling our relationships. But there has to be a healing component to it. Especially, they said, the next generation does not have to know what we went through. So they teach it in the schools, that everybody has equal opportunity. So when Canada was starting to take this road, they left out healing. They did give some healing dollars and budgets, but it wasn't enough, because you can tell it's not enough, because in this historical connection was this interruption, and it's called trauma. I can get into many examples of it, but the major one is removal from our children from their families, their communities, and taken to faraway places to be programmed. And it's went on for generations. So that was the means of trying to kill the Indian and the child. And I mean everything. Your worldview, your strengths, your teaching, survivor skills, your language, even to a point where they experimented on children to not have girls to have children. So I would say even the blood was trying to be attempted. Anyway, I've been teaching this since 1999, and I wasn't too, I was a little controversy, because I said Canada committed genocide. I can say that now. But back then, nobody wanted to hear that. Especially the way we shed our light to the world, that Canada is a place of justice, and, founding of the human rights and United Nations. But back home, they were defining, in Geneva, they're defining the code on genocide, and Canada was still committing genocide, because you just look at one of its lines, removal of children from one race to be handed over to another race. But there's other lines. So that's when I'm now in the events of growing up in the 70s. And then there are the likes of Murray Sinclair, Ted Fontaine, Phil Fontaine, many of my friends that I caught up with them in the 80s. I see historical events from the 80s. I was in the same rooms in the 90s, talking about we got to teach treaties to our people in 1996 at Lake Manitoba, because treaties is everything. Because at that time they weren't even talking about treaties. But now we get into the 2000s, we're getting to the creation of the Treaty Commission of Manitoba, Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. And then we get into events where that is bringing forward that we're all treaty people, that it's now part of the treaty curriculum. We help, TRCM help define for a lot of on land acknowledgement. It's just still being now spread out to the rest of Canada. So I was in a conference last year, just a couple of weeks ago in Toronto, and it was called Healing Reconciliation. And I was there to go over the history, because for a lot of them, they don't know this history. So the work that's been done here for many, many years is starting to take place now, after 9 years with the releasing of Truth and Reconciliation in Ontario. So I'm dusting off old stuff, saying this is what you gotta do. And then that's what the title is that we are all on a healing journey. Reconciling is basically fixing it. And the truth is to get you there to fix what? But the healing is the doing, the action. And it's beautiful to go to schools now where they reenact treaties. Children have these creative initiatives when it comes to treaties. Now wherever you go, people are wearing, women are wearing their skirts, their ribbon skirts, and men are wearing their medallions and their ribbon shirts, and it's everywhere. It's not just Indigenous people. They're wearing the red shirts, the orange shirts, or the red shirts. But you're seeing more of that going on, but you're not seeing this in the rest of the country. But we're ahead of the game. I was part of the cultural awareness for 3 years with the city of Winnipeg. And I said many things, but one of the things that I did see is the changing of the name of Bishop Grandin, because it was in my presentation. Why do you celebrate genocide? Here's the father of residential schools, and this is the one they quote, kill the Indian and the child. Why do you want to honor that guy with a boulevard? But later on, people pick up the mantle. They say, Treaty 1 says we got to do this, we got to make changes. The mayor and his council says we got to do this, got to make changes. And the environment was good now to make those changes. People at first that don't understand, all they have to do is listen to the children. The young people know. So as I look at my time, I just wanted to conclude that the work is not done. TRCM is much needed now than ever before, especially with the events of the Indian Act, 150th year. Our voices need to be heard. And don't be afraid of dismantling it, because we have the means to take and gut it out, but still have the connection to Revenue Canada. But we put it in our own process. And how do we interact as an agency? I learned that from Parks Canada. It's an agency that doesn't have a department where you have a minister, but basically you have all these treaty bodies that can look after the country better than saying a regional office under the Indian Act. This dismantling framework that we were pursuing back then is not going to work. Because we have too much organizations already, and I'm not. What I'm saying is not new. I say this all the time in front of the chiefs. I says, you got an Indian Act system, but you created more systems. You got tribal councils, you got Southern Chiefs, MKO, AMC, AFN, and by the time anything gets trickled down to our local level, everybody got their piece. But who has a voice to change the whole system? So I said it has to be a treaty voice, not an elected voice. It's their system. As long as we stay in that system, we're going to have a harder time at it. But guess what? We need to educate ourselves. Education, truth, reconciling the relationships, even with ourselves. But that's part of the healing process. To be somewhere where we got left out over 100 and almost 150 years ago, we just got left out where we all would have prospered if they stick to the original vision of treaty. But it's not too late. Because the next generation is getting all the facts. And they're going to inherit this world. But you got to give them all the facts. And that's where all the hope lies, because I see it today. And I want to say, really, Commissioner Beretta, you're part of that legacy of a whole line of others that brought this place together. Those are our elders, those are our original chiefs, all the way to 1871. That talks about where we are in a very trying time. But we can't lose the vision of what we do is for the next set of generations to come. It's for our children. Never lose sight of that. So, Akanadan away maganak, miigwech.